Mental hospital workers of Reddit, what's the craziest thing you've seen on the job? This was more frustrating than anything, but we had one patient who had a tendency to chew on and then swallow batteries. Now, a lot of our patient group would repeatedly swallow certain risk items that they weren't supposed to have access to, including tweezers and forks. But this patient was a particular concern as they'd repeatedly been taken to A&E over the issue. It was found that the leaking battery acid was starting to really up their stomach and could potentially be fatal. So naturally, it became an immediate priority to take additional precaution against it happening again. Fortunately, batteries were extremely difficult to find on the ward, as all remotes and such were locked away. In addition, they only had arm's-length supervised access to items that contained any batteries, which had usually been taped inside regardless. However, the patient in question discovered a trick to get around this. This involved going to the toilet, defecating, sorting through their excrement, plucking out the recycled battery, chewing on it, and then swallowing it again to continue to cycle. Once this started happening, the decision was made to lock their bathroom at all times and supervise them whenever they had to use it. So around that time, I was doing my observations on the ward, which basically involved checking in on all of the patients every 5 minutes to make sure they were still alive. The battery swallower was in their room, just sprawled out on their bed with a sheet over their lower half and reading a book. When I'd open their door, they'd smile and nod at me before going back to reading. They'd appeared settled in mood throughout the day, so I wasn't particularly concerned about anything. During one later check, I noticed that they had repositioned themselves so that they were now lying on their side instead of their stomach and facing the door. They also looked a little flustered. I asked them if they were okay, and they said they were fine. I didn't have much of a reason to not trust them, plus I had to check everyone else, so I just took their word for it and moved on. As it neared the end of my hour of doing observations, I opened their door and immediately recoiled from the stench. It was atrocious, like someone had bombed an open sewer with mustard gas. The patient was still sat on their bed, but now they were quite red in the face and smiling at me with their eyes opened wide. Naturally, I immediately asked them, "What in the name of is that smell?" in more professional wording. They tried to respond to me, but their voice came out muffled and incomprehensible. And as I stood there staring at them, I realized that their mouth was full and they were trying to swallow something. It was too late to do anything at that point, but it dawned on me that ever since they had moved onto their side on the bed, they'd been trying to onto their hand so that they could swallow the battery. It had obviously taken a while to push it out there, and we later found out that they'd just plucked the entire turd out of themselves and stuffed it into their mouth. The worst bit was speaking to them afterwards and having to take in their breath and seeing their teeth. Oh, and the battery wasn't even in there, so they'd essentially eaten their own shit for nothing. Story 2. One of my most memorable incidents as a med student was when I had to follow the treatment of an inpatient for a couple of weeks. I was assigned this 23-year-old Polynesian girl that had schizophrenia. She had religious delusions and was convinced she was the second coming of Jesus. Fascinating character, and she was really well read when it came to theology. 1 week into my clerking of her, another inpatient came in. He was a 40-year-old Aboriginal man that also thought he was the second coming of Jesus. Initially, these two, Jesuses, had open confrontations and verbal arguments over theology, and who was the legitimate Jesus. Both thought the other was clearly a fraud and mental, but neither possessed the insight to recognize that they themselves might be deluded. After an initial week of drama, the fights settled down. The next week, during their outside leave time, both were found having sex in the bushes outside the hospital, surrounded by weed and meth. Turns out, they had reconciled their differences. They realized that both were carriers of the Spirit of Jesus, and were going to give birth to the actual Jesus. Over the coming few months, I kept an eye on my patients' records. They got busted having sex a couple more times, until the suitable outpatient setting was found for the man. The girl did end up getting pregnant, and I assumed she did have the baby. I didn't check to see whether she did give birth to Jesus. Story 3. I'm a nursing student who had my psychiatric chalked mental health clinical in a mental health crisis center. In all reality, it's not really that crazy. It's mostly Baker Acts for people who are severely depressed, or people who are neglecting themselves due to their mental illness. Mental health units have a lot of negative stigma associated with them being for crazies and whatnot, but really they're just sick people trying to get better, just like any other hospital. Even the patients with schizophrenia or psychosis are usually there because their meds got out of whack and they are being rebalanced. That being said, the most crazy and heartbreaking case I dealt with was an 8-year-old child who grew up watching his stepdad abuse his mom, but could not do anything about it, so he would internalize his emotions, leading to self-harm and suicidal ideation that culminated in him stabbing himself through the arm with scissors at school when he was being bullied. Hearing about how he wished he could just end his life at such a young age was absolutely heartbreaking and really put into perspective minimal. My problems were compared to this kid who had gone through more in 8 years emotionally than I have in 20. Story 4. People being psychotic and even the violent are things you get used to. The extreme incompetence of a large portion of the staff members and the awesome job the administration did of ignoring it was absolutely shocking. For the most part, it was a mess leading to misdiagnosis, understaffing, and mistreatment of patients. But some of them seemed outright malicious. One of a nurse would constantly escalate situations to the point of restraints and drugs being used in order to get back at patients who insulted her. I feel I should note that there are several who were absolute pros, whose skills I truly admired, but they could only pick up so much slack. Story 5. During my several sojourns into inpatient care when I was in my teens and early 20s, there was one male psych nurse assigned to a ward full of female patients between the ages of 16 and 21. You could remain in the youth or juvenile ward until you were 21, because of reasons I don't remember now. Patient problems ranged from depression and anxiety disorders to violent psychosis. Substance abuse was common. It was well known among the patients that you could get cigarettes, alcohol, Adderall, and Vicodin from this one nurse in exchange for sexual favors. He was there for years. He was reported on occasion, but those reports never led to any disciplinary action because, well, who would you believe? The disturbed young ladies with a history of mental illness, behavioral problems, and substance abuse, or the clean-cut, well-loved psychiatric employee with a squeaky, clean record? Edit to clarify. Nurse Guy was way more subtle about this than I make it sound. He wasn't handing out pills like Skittles and getting a dozen blowjobs a day, and he was good at picking victims. And also the facility was understaffed and not well run. Story 6. I was a rec therapist at a state hospital after college. I worked in what was the aggressive male unit. We had all the murders, child molesters, and aggressive males. On the unit, there was a wing that was locked at all times for the patients that needed extra supervision. One guy was actually court committed to this wing. He would take advantage of the weak, so he was on a Q15, which was a visual check every 15 mins. Once they found him in the bathroom, during a check buying pee from another patient for $2. He told the staff that he wanted to gain the power and strength of the other patient. Another guy didn't have an axis eye diagnosis, only mild mental retardation, but was aggressive at times and really big, so the state sent him to the hospital because there was nowhere else for him. He would love cookies and snacks, but did not have money. He figured out that if he went to the actual hospital, they would bring him cookies, snacks, and Shasta ginger ale. So he began to swallow things to go to the hospital. If not watched closely, he would pull a clock off the wall and swallow the batteries just to get snacks. After I left the hospital, I read a story in the paper about a patient drinking bleach and dying. So I called an old coworker and they confirmed that the patient swallowed bleach after a janitor left a utility closet door unlocked. I have so many stories about that place. I miss working there. It was hands down the most fun I ever had at a job. All the patients loved me because I was the guy that would hang out with them and take them out of the hospital on field trips. Story 7. Question I actually have answers for. All of these are secondhand from when my mom worked the front desk, so take that as you will. One guy got into a straight-up screaming match with his girlfriend, the soda machine. Like, how dare you do this to me? Don't you know how much I've done for you in this family? The whole shebang. One kid, when she worked admissions, came into her office and trashed it, then broke a red pen, splashed it on himself and on the wall, can confirm the wall splash, saw it firsthand, and tried to start screaming that she was attacking him. My mom is like the sweetest woman you will ever meet. So the techs were having none of this kid shit. One time, some guy walked in from the street carrying a frozen turkey. Mom saw him sit down in the lobby. He sat there for a solid hour and a half, then got up and left. No clue what was up there. The last one is the only time my mom has ever been creeped out. One evening, the cops brought in this teenager, maybe 15 or so. She had ankle cuffs, wrist cuffs, and this weird belt that both sets of cuffs were attached to. They brought her in and basically stood her in the center of the waiting room. While the cops got her paperwork sorted out, this chick just bored holes into my mom's head with her eyes, freaked mom out enough to the point that she requested to be let off early to get away from this kid. I'm sure if I asked her, I could get some more if anyone is interested. Edit. I got one other, not quite intense story from her. When she moved to the business office originally, their office had windows facing the courtyard where patients would have rec time essentially. She liked to keep her blinds open, and one day, a patient noticed her. He kept waving at her and started doing what looked like sprints halfway down the courtyard and back. He waves at her again, and on his last sprint, He keeps going, climbs the wall, and takes off across the roof. Mom was like, "OPTF," and yelled at her boss that someone just escaped across the roof. Police get called, guy gets found, just casually walking a few blocks away like nothing was wrong. Oh, story 8. I didn't technically work there. It was a clinical rotation for school. But I have a couple stories. So this paranoid patient, who was relatively pleasant, told us that there was a bat in her room. This was an inpatient facility. Patients don't typically go outside, and windows don't open easily. She was brushed off. One day during rounds, she repeats that things are going well, but there's a bat in her room. She caught it. Everyone was doubtful. But sure enough, she pulls down her bed sheets, and there's a goddamn bat trapped underneath that flies out. Felt real bad that people wrote her off for that. So now I'm very careful with people who claim to have seen or felt things that seem unlikely. Story 9. I'm going to be that guy. Not a mental hospital worker, but I'm currently residing in the local private clinic and have been for the past few months. This place is usually for people who are recovering from PTSD or depression ECT, so not many crazy people get in. Despite this, there have been 2 instances where crazy people got in. The place I'm staying at has 2 floors, which are each different wards, though the only real difference is who is in there and what staff is on at what times and days. Floor 2 also has a bigger common room, but floor 2, we've got reclining chairs in ours. Anyway, the first incident took place on floor 2, and I must have been out or something because I completely missed it. What I've gathered, though, is that a woman was running around the floor naked and screaming, and also going into rooms and assaulting patients. She was detained and likely banned from the premises. At least that's what I assume would be the case. The second one I was kind of involved in, but I missed the majority of it. I was sitting in a chair waiting for my observations. Blood pressure, pulse, and temperature to be done by a nurse when a lady was filling up her water bottle in the water cooler beside me. As she was walking back to her room, I briefly glanced up at her as you do when someone passes you, and she said, "What are you looking at?" in a tone that made me fully prepared to have water thrown in my face. After this, she was immediately escorted back to her room and told not to leave while saying, "What? I'm unwell," in a tone that made it obvious she was aware of her actions. To further my evidence of this, she came out a minute or so later and splashed water on me again, while saying, "Whoops," in an obnoxious, sarcastic tone. Same thing happened. Nurses were sterner when telling her not to come out again. Anyway, my nurse had done my observations, and I headed back to my room. The woman came out again and was stopped about 6 meters from me, and she apparently came out to apologize, though suspiciously still came with the bottle in hand. I just said, "Yeah, all right," and headed back to my room to shower as it was nearing bedtime, and I thought I may as well shower while already wet. Upon leaving my room, I immediately noticed that the common room was a mess with coffee and sandwich slices all over the floor. I wondered what had happened, but shrugged it off and went to go get my night medication, where I was told by a nurse that the woman was gone and not coming back. I put 2 and 2 together and determined she must have made a mess of the common room and caused further chaos, causing her to be kicked out. That was only half correct. The next day, I asked a woman who witnessed the whole event what happened, and she told me that the crazy woman picked up a metal signpost that was in the hall and almost bashed a nurse over the head with it. She proceeded to make her way to the common room, where she tipped a mug of, thankfully not freshly made, coffee onto a patient's head before picking up his plate of sandwiches and attempting to beat him over the head with them. Thankfully, the sandwiches were cling-wrapped to the plate, which softened the blow. She then threw the plate against a wall. After this, the police came and arrested her, all while I was taking a shower. TLDR, I zone out a lot in the shower. Story 10. I'll start with an apology for my poor storytelling. I just read this over before posting, and it's nowhere near as interesting and or funny as it has been when I've told it in person. I worked as a registered mental nurse, RMN, in the UK for over 20 years, before giving it up for the sake of my own sanity. There was a time when there were 3 Jesuses on the ward. Contrary to popular conception, the number of psychiatric patients who have delusions of being Jesus is fairly small. This might be a cultural thing, though. Maybe in the Bible Belt of the USA, it is more common. I was only in the PQ, Psychiatric Intensive Care Unit, what used to be called the Locked Ward, to let the staff there attend a meeting. I worked in a secure unit for mentally disordered offenders, and several of us had come across to provide relief cover. The incident started between 2 men in their 20s, each arguing that the other couldn't be Jesus because he was... This went on for 5 to 10 minutes, with the arguments ranging from the deeply philosophical to puerile insults. I don't remember the actual words, as this was way back in 1989, as none of us really knew either patient, and there was no obvious sign that the argument would escalate. We were just keeping an eye on the 2 guys as well as everyone else. All was quietish until the 3rd Jesus arrived. The 2 original guys lost the plot when the third Jesus started insisting that they were the real deal. The first two were prepared to accept that it was possible for Jesus to be two people at the same time, that he could do so in the one place without being aware of himself, that he, both of him, could be detained against his will by these lowly humans, and all the other apparent contradictions. I'm fairly sure they could have accepted the existence of the third incarnation of the Messiah too. If not for one factor, God might well have chosen to become flesh in West London in the late 1980s, twice, in the same ward of the local psychiatric hospital at the same time, subjecting himself to the control of mere mortals such as I. He moves in mysterious ways, after all, his wonders to perform. All that was fair enough. What wasn't apparently possible, though, was that he would choose to do so as a she. You can't be Jesus, you're a woman, said Jesus 1. I'm the Son of God. I can be whatever I want to be, said Jesus 3. And this was when things got out of hand. Tables overturned, cups, ashtrays, and chairs sent flying, and some of the most ungodly language I ever heard. Luckily, the regular ward staff came back into the building just as it all kicked off, and we were able to go back to our own unit. Unlucky also, though, as I'd like to have seen how it all panned out. Story 11. So, I didn't work at a facility, but I was committed to one when I was in high school. I was falsely accused of threatening to shoot up my school and was required to be an inpatient for at minimum 5 days or be expelled. The school gave me an official apology after that 5-day period because I was accused by a girl who had come on to me, and I rejected her. She suffered 0 repercussions, but did voluntarily switch schools after she saw I returned. I never spoke to her after I came back or even looked at her. This was circa 99 Zex. So very shortly after Columbine, I see a lot of other posts talking about how most folks in there are just rebalancing or things like eating forks and batteries. But my experience was a little different. Everyone had a double bed room and didn't get to pick their roommates. Before I get into that, there were about 10 other kids, ranging from about 5, 6 to 17, in the ward with me. First day, we all sat at a table for arts and crafts time or socializing or something, and one of the kids almost immediately goes, "Hey, you're new. If you give me a hand job, I'll give you one." He's at most 8 years old, and I'm 15. I say, "What the chi?" And another kid goes, "Ignore him. He's stupid. Do you want us to beat him up?" I just kind of hesitated, not knowing what to say. And one of them gets up, grabs the kid by the shoulder, and drags him into the corner where the orderlies can't see from their desk. 2 or 3 other kids just start wailing on him in the torso area. Not super hard, but enough to make you wince pretty hard. There was another girl there who propositioned me. She was apparently a cheerleader from another high school in the area, and a coke addict. I was a virgin at the time, and a little weirded out by someone in a psych ward hitting on me so fast. One of the guys that beat the kid up did end up somehow having sex with her. I have no idea how. One of the orderlies was also rumored to have fooled around with her, and other minor girls. At the end of my first night, a roommate appeared. He was screaming when they brought him in. Turns out this kid is suicidal, so he has to be on suicide watch, which means someone sits at the doorway of our room with the hallway light on all night. Yeah, even worse, this kid thought he was either possessed by Satan or had a direct line to him and would whisper, talk to me all night about how the red blinking light on the smoke detector was Satan's camera, and he was watching me and proud of me. Lastly, the kid from the first part that propositioned me, he was being released a day or 2 before me. I remember asking him, "So what are you going to do when you get home?" And he responds, "Man, I can't wait to be home. I can't wait to see my family. The first thing I'm going to do when I see my mom, man, I'm going to stab her." So yeah, some of those people are unstable as shit. Story 12. Not an employee, but someone who had to be placed into a unit for about 3 months as a teenager. We had some free time scheduled in for a few hours every day. Most of us were just depressed, suicidal, or had eating disorders. There was one girl who had been abused as a child, and she had been there for a couple years. She was odd. One day there was a lot of screaming from the common room, and a bunch of orderlies had to pin her down on the floor. She had bitten off her finger and then went all Mike Tyson and bit a chunk off one of the orderlies' ears. I am happy to say that I was moved very shortly after. Story 13. One morning, a new admission needed to give a urine sample. During her assessment, she seemed relatively aware of things, so nobody thought she'd have difficulty with it. So I gave her the cup and explained I needed a urine sample. She stared at me blankly. I repeated myself, and when I got no response, I explained I needed to stay in the bathroom to make sure it was a genuine sample. The urine was her own. I turned to give her privacy. The next thing I know, I heard the sink running. She was trying to fill the cup with water. I re-explained exactly what I needed from her. She stared blankly. Mind you, I'm trying to put it as simply as possible at this point. I turned back around to give her privacy. Next thing I know, she's naked and in the shower. I re-explain what I need, and after 15 minutes of this, she complied. I left her in the bathroom and delivered the urine sample to the RN. I was then on assignment of watching a male patient whose room was next to that particular bathroom. I hear the bathroom door open, but I don't think anything of it. I start to feel uncomfortable, but I can't place why exactly. I happen to turn around to find the female patient from before standing directly behind me, completely naked, staring me down. I avert my eyes and explain. She needs to return to the bathroom and put on her clothes. She stares silently, makes an almost unbreakable eye contact with me, and starts rubbing lotion on her breasts. I explain to her again I need her in her bedroom or the bathroom, and call for the nurse. The patient goes in her room as the nurse comes over. When the nurse knocks on her door, the patient comes out fully clothed and stated she had no idea what anybody was talking about. Psychotic patients sure are fun. Story 14. While I was doing clinicals, nothing terribly exciting happened because we were kept in the safest unit. But one of the longer-term staff there told us about a girl who was in her room and rubbed holes into both forearms to commit suicide. He had even taken pictures, which were super raunchy, though badly lit. But this girl had rubbed the skin and veins in her arm down to the bone. Obviously, she died. Story 15. Not a worker, but I was institutionalized as a kid. There are a few things that have stayed with me. My roommate was getting discharged, and her mom snuck her in a lighter. She tied a string to the lighter and hid it inside her vagina for a few days because she said she wanted to smoke as soon as she got out. In reality, she would need to go somewhere to get cigarettes anyway. I think it just gave her a good feeling to have something contraband on her after being locked up for so long. Another girl I was in with carved, and I mean carved the word into the entirety of her forearm. I remember how the scars would catch the light. This particular gal would often receive the booty juice, as they say, a tranquilizer shot to the butt cheek. Literally every day in morning group, this one staff member would make a point of saying how disgusting it was to put underwear in the dirty clothes bins in our rooms if they had any blood on them. She said every single day that it smelled bad, we were gross, etc. And we were required to notify a staff member if we had leaked on our underwear at all. It might not sound that weird, but she just made such a point of shaming us. And this is an example that stands out in my mind, among others. This lady was incredibly horrible and abusive. Her name was Candace. I remember her well because during my first skin check, she cornered me in a bathroom, no cameras, and physically ripped my clothes off. I was 14 years old and she was the first person to ever see me naked, and it was against my will. It was incredibly traumatizing. I'm in my 20s now, a senior in college, and I still want to cry when I think about it. What a horrible thing to put mentally ill teenage girls through. I know I wasn't the only one. I left the hospital in considerably worse shape than I was when I came there, and I don't know anyone who has been there who wouldn't say the same. Story 16. This might be the worst experience. NSFL lunch, diarrhea. Had a patient whose personal hygiene was a 3 to 4 on a scale of 1 to 10 most days. His diet wasn't the best either, and so his stools weren't solid. He was also overweight, drank a lot of coffee, and smoked a lot of cigarettes. One morning, he got a cup of coffee and went out for his first cigarette of the day. If you don't know, coffee is a laxative and can loosen bowels. That first cigarette on a rainy Oregon day triggered his smoker's cough, and the cough caused him to fire about a quarter more of soggy diarrhea into his blue jeans. How do I know? I stepped out of the office to a very peculiar smell and saw a dime-sized brown splop that looked like chocolate rice pudding. Every 5 or 6 inches, there was a splop ranging in size from a dime to a 50-cent piece. This disgusting Hansel and Gretel trail led from the back porch, through the dining area, into the living room, up the stairs, down the hall to his room. Just as I come around the corner, this patient, with whom I share a name, so let's call him Crazy Acrollo, is mid-stride between his room and the bathroom, which are directly across the hall from one another. He's mid-stride like Bigfoot in that video, and he freezes in that position like the guy on the walk sign, if the guy on the walk sign could also remind you of Sasquatch. I say, "Crazy Acrollo, what the hell happened?" He said, "Acrollo, I had an accident. Leave me alone." And he charges into the bathroom and slams the door. I tell him that I'm going to get his soiled clothing into the wash, which I do. I then have to get the mop bucket and bleach solution and mop a trail of diarrhea droplets through 3 community spaces and up a flight of stairs. I have to write an advanced incident report since human waste was involved and constitutes a biohazard for our facility. I should add that my boss and her boss were both lazy pieces of shit who never showed up on time. So I was also trying to prep breakfast and do medication pass for 15 residents within a 2-hour time frame. TLDR. Residents' smoker's cough triggers a diarrheal explosion, which he tracks more than 50 yards through a large facility, up a flight of stairs, and into his room. I catch him butt-ass naked in the middle of a shit-stained sprint to the showers. Story 17. This wasn't me, but a friend of mine worked as an OT at a mental health facility. One patient, Mr. Jones, found an unlocked room in the hospital filled with unused office furniture. For a couple of weeks, he visited the room and peed and shit into a drawer in one of the desks, then one day ate most of the fermented mess. The staff found him wandering the hallways, covered in his own piss and vomit. Story 18. Late to the party, but I have a story for this. It was more or less a short-term, lower-risk facility, where patients or their families usually checked in and out. There were a few longer-term patients, and of course, the involuntary ones who would come back due to mandated sentencing. One of the latter was a bipolar woman who would stay with us when she was manic since they were worried she might be dangerous to herself when she was awake for days and delusional. On night shift, we literally drew straws to see who sat with her. She had to have 24 HR watch. I know it sounds mean, but you get desensitized. She didn't really like people, and she usually spent her time quietly talking to herself in the corner of her room, so the person on watch basically sat on a chair near the door, in case you needed to get someone, and read a book. I had just started on nights when I got picked to watch her. For some reason, she took a liking to me and talked to me all night. She explained she had checked herself in this time because a particularly nasty couple was following her for the duration of this episode. They were the reason she couldn't sleep. She told me that she was a nice person, but they were awful, and then proceeded to describe in vivid detail a young redneck couple that were sitting on either side of me. She said that the man was very angry with the world and wanted to hurt everyone, including her, but that he thought I was pretty, so he didn't want to hurt me and hoped I liked him. She said this made the woman angry and jealous, and she was describing to her all the ways she wanted to hurt me. Needless to say, it was an unnerving night, and I only made it through about half my shift before I got my supervisor and explained that I didn't feel very safe with her, projecting that anger onto me for some reason. She was still there when I left that job, so I never found out what the root of that particular delusion was, or if there was maybe someone in her life that I reminded her of to have had that big of an effect on her. Story 19. I did a weekend patient at a mental hospital last year for severe depression and anxiety that built up to a mental breakdown that scared the out of my parents and got my ass sent straight to the loony bin. For a week, I lived with about 16 other girls, and for the most part, we were all in there for the same reason, except for one girl who was really off her rocker. She would be everyone's friend, but at the same time would kind of bully the other girls, almost like a dominance thing. Did all kinds of random bullshit to the other girls, like making weird noises in their faces and farting or burping loudly right next to them and then looking at them and laughing. She never messed with me though, except for once, and I made sure she knew damn well not to do it again. Anyways, she was a character. In group, she talked about how she wanted to murder her family and kill herself. And then after group, she would eat lunch with us and act like all was dandy. There was another girl who had permanent scars down the sides of her face from scratching, and she was a frightening character to be around. She was my roommate. Anyways, the institution I was at. We had no treatment plan like they were telling my parents, and the only therapy we had was once a day for about an hour, and was just bullshit, where we talked about our feelings and did bullshit worksheets so they could check it off their to-do list and say, they gave it to us. The entire rest of the day, I would just sit in this room with these other girls and color or play cards if I could get one of the only 2 decks we had. That place. Only time I've ever attempted suicide was in that hellhole. Story 20. I don't work in a mental hospital, but I've seen plenty on the mental health ward at the prison I work in. I'm not sure why all of the best stories involve shit, but they do. Anyway, I had just started as a fairly new nurse and was completely new to corrections when I came in short one night to an awful stench in the foyer of our infirmary. When you enter into the infirmary, the officer's station is behind glass to your right, and on the back wall is a window that looks in on our mental health observation cell. On this day, we had a fellow that was 1 or 2 cards shy of a full deck. He had some serious issues, to say the least. He was also one that liked to play with his shit if he got angry. He'd literally use it as Play-Doh and smear it all over the cell. This particular day, a group of the nurses on the shift before mine denied a request of his due to his behavior. So, of course, he starts smearing shit everywhere. So, shortly after he started doing that, change of shift happens, and I come on to relieve those nurses that pissed him off. As I enter to make my rounds, I notice names of the previous shift's nurses written on the wall on his shit. While asking how he was doing and if he felt okay, I asked what all the names on the wall were for, and received an answer I didn't expect at the time. He looked me straight in the eye and, as serious as possible, said, "It's my shit list, and you don't want to be on it, do you?" I am usually great at maintaining my composure, but his demeanor and the seriousness in which he said it, I lost it and had to walk off the ward's hall. Needless to say, I made the shit list later on. In no way am I making fun of his condition. It's a very serious diagnosis, but sometimes if you can make light of it, you have to for your own sanity. Story 21. I don't personally work in the field, but my sister and a few of my friends do and have told me some wild tales. A friend worked in a medium secure facility, and one gentleman there had two outstanding issues: a strong loathing for wearing clothes and a strong need to have to touch new things with his penis. Often he'd find his way into the staff office and end up touching all the staff's items with his dingling. There was one day where the planets aligned and it all went weird. They just had new fire exit signs installed and were having a review conducted by a local agency. As the inspectors were walking around, they hear a thudding noise that's steadily growing. They turn to see a 16-stone man, completely naked, run towards them, jump up, kick off a radiator, touch a sign with his John Thomas, and land with an almighty crash on the floor. He rights himself, smiles at them with a look of total satisfaction, and walks away. The inspectors were totally dumbfounded. My sister works at an end-of-life dementia unit. Average stay is 6 to 12 months. I'd never be able to work there, but my sister is a AEA legend in my eyes. Anywho, there was this little old lady who was by far one of the friendliest people she'd ever worked with, and always asked, "Have you got any sweeties?" Anyone that came to visit would be asked. One day, my sister comes round and notices she's munching away on something. "I see you've got some sweeties there. What have you got?" "I've got some chocolate. Michael was kind enough to share with me." My sister freezes. Michael's not had anyone visit for a few days now, and his family didn't bring any chocolate. She risks a glance at Michael. His hands are dirty, like really dirty. She wanders over and the smell hits her. "Michael, where did you get that chocolate?" "Well, I found some tucked away in my pocket and thought I'd share it." "Which pocket is that?" "This one." And Michael proceeds to drop his trousers, showing his very clearly full adult nappy. Now my sister can't eat fudge. Story 22. Not a mental health professional, but I worked in an inpatient psychiatric ward as an intern in the schizophrenia center. I heard a lot of wild things while I worked there. And here's one story I'll share. One day I was in on morning rounds with the doctors, and we had a patient who had been admitted the previous night for a psychotic break. You really only have the people with severe debilitating psychosis spend nights in the schizophrenia inpatient unit. Anyways, this person was admitted against their will and as quite aggressive. They had a warrant for their arrest for stabbing someone in the eye with a pencil at their anonymous drug abuse meeting. So we spent the entire morning plotting a way to get the police in to arrest them without them knowing it was going to happen. So we spent the entire morning meeting with this person who was angry because the person insisted they were not psychotic or schizophrenic, but we had to justify to this person why they needed to be in the unit, and also set plans with the police to come at a particular time for the arrest and orchestrate their entrance into the unit. Anyways, near the end of my shift, the cops showed up to arrest this patient who stabbed someone in the eye. The person heard they were coming, turned violent, started to attack hospital staff, and had to be restrained by multiple security guards, which was a huge scene. Then the cops came and were eventually able to arrest the person after much resistance, and the person went to jail. For those wondering, the person who got stabbed had to undergo significant surgery to recover. Not sure how they are doing now. Story 23. A few years back, I was misdiagnosed with bipolar disorder, and when I went to the ER because the meds were making me have suicidal ideation, I was Baker acted. It was the worst 5 days of my life. It was scary and upsetting, and the staff were either really nice or rude, impatient, and inattentive. My roommate would feel good about yourself nightly. Other patients would share really disturbing things with me. It smelled awful. The food was awful. My bed was uncomfortable, and I had trouble sleeping. A patient choked herself out with a bedsheet. Another patient stabbed herself with a pen, so they took our pens away and I couldn't draw or write. A staff member had her face bashed pretty hard by a tall, large patient, and there was a lot of blood. I woke up every morning to screams, and it was surreal to realize as I woke you that no, it's not a dream. You're really here. This is really happening to you. In the long run, the most frustrating thing was the cost and the level of care we got. I have really good insurance from work, so it was pretty much covered, but many patients in there had little to no means and were signing forms accepting the charge for care, which was like $1,500 a day, and some seemed to have no idea what they were signing. The care involved basic group therapy and meds. I feel the other patients deserved better. It was an eye-opening and heartbreaking experience. Mental health deserves more attention, better quality, and easier, more affordable access. Story 24. Don't work in mental health anymore, but used to work in a psych hospital. I think there's some phenomenon that when people get put into a seclusion room, they immediately strip naked and shit on the floor. Anyway, here's a couple things that I remember. One guy came in, and after we did his strip search, we let him redress in the bathroom. It was taking a super long time, so we knocked and opened the door. Turns out he was eating his dirty underwear in a hasty suicide attempt. Like, what a way to try to go out. One guy came in with psychosis, He was homeless, so he had all his belongings with him. We check everyone's belongings in upon admittance. We opened his backpack and found tons of dildos and butt plugs, along with photo albums of Polaroid pictures he'd taken of women's butts. Never seen so many sex toys in my life, and had to count and log all the dirty butt plugs. One client was out for a walk, super manic, running around the courtyard, managed to catch hold of a duck, and in his excitement, strangled the poor thing to death. Rip duck. One client used like 10 journals and wrote the most obscene and offensive feel-good about yourself ever. I wish I could have copied it. Stuff about thorny dicks and tentacles. And then he'd go loudly feel good about yourself in the showers, which were directly in front of the nurse's station. Another client, in the middle of a treatment meeting, spit his dentures across the table, like launched them out of his mouth, laughing hysterically. Said his main problem was that he was feel good about yourself, ting so much there were sperms flying out the windows. Most of the time, people were just cool, though. We had dance parties and laughed about stuff and had really interesting conversations about life. I think I learned a lot from my clients. Story 25. I did my internship at a state mental hospital about 11 years ago. There was a guy there who spoke mostly Spanish and was known for exposing himself to various women throughout the campus. He wasn't on my caseload, but he came to plenty of my groups and was polite to me and well-behaved. My last day at the hospital, he walks up to me and hands me a crumbled brown paper bag and says he got something for me in his broken English. I was terrified to look inside, knowing his reputation and his violent history, but I peeked in and was shocked to see a small pink teddy bear. I still have it. Story 26. This will likely be buried, but oh well. I didn't work in a psych hospital, but as a med student, I did a rotation in a psycher, dealing with mostly acutely psychotic or manic patients. Had a guy with known schizophrenia picked up at a barbershop after he told the poor barber in full detail how he liked to rape children. When we interviewed him, he went on for about 30 minutes, calmly explaining in graphic detail about how he liked to rape and murder children, have random sex with strangers hoping he would get HIV so he could then spread it to other people, do drugs and so on. He also then went on in detail about how earlier that day he found a stray cat, raped it, then ate it. Luckily for all those involved and for society as a whole, we made some phone calls to family and discovered that most of his claims, especially about the children, were false, and that when he went off of his meds, he typically liked to make these claims. We eventually decided to transfer him to another psych facility in the city, since they were much more familiar with him and his private psychiatrist worked there. While he was waiting, he went to a holding area where he could be monitored. About 20 minutes later, one of the nurses comes back to the doctor's area to inform us that the patient had one episode of vomiting, but was otherwise okay, and that the transpo came for him, and he was leaving. We all said, sure, let us know if anything changes. About 10 minutes after that, the same nurse comes back again, this time white as a ghost. Doctor, there was cat hair in the vomit. Story 27. Not my own story. However, it's told by a psychiatrist, Gary Fisher, so it counts. The craziest thing he ever saw in the field of mental health occurred in 1962. First, the background. In the late 1950s, Fisher and a number of colleagues began a pilot study treating children with severe childhood onset schizophrenia and autism with LSD and psilocybin. These children were considered to be essentially untreatable, basket cases as it were. There was little other option for them other than to wait for them to die. On balance, the treatment led to significant improvements in the condition of the vast majority of the children. There was one in particular, named of Nancy, who was nonverbal and severely self-harming. It wasn't known prior to the successive treatments. However, she was a victim of prepubescent rape by her grandfather. Although whether this was causative to her condition or merely exacerbated it is impossible to say. In the course of one treatment, she became much calmer and resumed the capacity for speech. Over the full course of, if I recall correctly, 12 treatments, she regained mobility, verbosity, interest in life, and interactivity with the staff and with other patients. There's an archive with Fisher is well worth listening to in full. So, what was the craziest thing Fisher saw? In 1962, without adequate explanation or a moment's thought given to patient outcomes, the institution shut the program down. Even to this day, no further research along these lines has been conducted anywhere. There may be some isolated cases where parents, or particularly iconoclastic doctors and other therapists, have administered LSD or psilocybin to children. However, it is unlikely that any formal records have been kept. Story 28. My dad is a doctor in a mental hospital, so my dinner table conversations as a kid were these kind of stories. The two that immediately jump out are: schizophrenic woman escapes off of a locked ward. She is missing for a few hours despite being obese. They find her eating a squirrel with her bare hands. Presumably, the squirrel was roadkill when she found it because of her weight. She couldn't have caught a live one. Not great, but I always felt bad for the squirrel. Now, the real nightmare one. My dad pulled a cockroach out of someone's tongue. Yeah, a full-grown cockroach pulled squirming out of this patient's tongue. What they assume happened was patient ate some roach eggs, along with something that cut their tongue, and the egg hatched inside the tongue. Like they saw something they wanted to eat on a filthy floor and got a handful of eggs, something sharp, piece of glass, drywall, nail, along with whatever they ate. A few weeks later, when they are admitted, their tongue looks horrible. So my dad investigates and finds a goddamn roach in there. Right after he tells me this story, he tries to convince me to eat the rest of the green beans on my plate. I'll never forget that dinner, and now you won't either. If you'd like more stories from when I volunteered there, I'll be happy to provide some. Story 29. Psychiatric registered nurse here. Not the craziest, but something I'll never forget. We had this one patient who was legitimately born of incest. She had a huge alien head, patchy red hair like Chuck's, and weirdly shaped toes. When she didn't get her way, she would come up to the nurse's station with blood trickling out of her mouth. I'd say, "What is it, X?" And she'd say, "I did this," and proceed to show me where she ripped her entire fingernails off before taking another one, biting it off, and eating it in front of me. She did this so much I would finally just watch in boredom, eating my lunch as she chowed down on her crunchy toenails in the medicine administration window. Story 30. Another case I saw as a medical student involved this South Korean lady that had come to Australia to study. She ended up having a psychotic break and thinking the North Korean government was after her. She was picked up by the police after they found her barricading herself in her student flats. When we saw her, she'd been in the hospital for 3 weeks, and plans were being made to get her back home to South Korea. She had settled down, and the medications were seeming to have worked. My friend and I went to see her with the attending. During the interview, she looked visibly scared. She kept staring at my friend, who is of Chinese descent. She then started muttering to herself and looking more disconcerted throughout the interview. My attending remarked that she seemed very unsettled compared to how she was yesterday. The patient was visibly sweating and looked terrible. She was silent for a while and then asked the attending if my friend was real or a North Korean spy. My attending reassured her that my friend was a medical student and was real. She immediately calmed down. She had enough insight to know that she had a psychotic break and was trying to piece together whether my friend was part of her delusions or not. It's so sad to see schizophrenics like that. They know they have delusions, but their delusions seem so real they can't cope, and they have a high suicide rate. Massively deluded schizophrenics can take comfort in their ignorance. Story 31. Not a mental health facility, but a nursing home. Elderly people are batshit cray, love them. I was unlocking a resident's wheelchair to get her back to her room after bingo or crafts or whatever. The other resident, who never spoke, seated at the table, is shaking her fist at me with a menacing look in her eye. I continue unlocking the other wheel and notice a massive pile of vomit under the threatening resident. Another resident collected napkins so she could piss on them and distribute them everywhere. Another one would get super irate and screech at me with personal insults for helping her at bingo. Fine, Gertrude, but you don't ever seem to win otherwise. So many of those folks died there without a single visitor. Story 32. Not a psychiatric hospital, just a normal acute floor for a big hospital. When I was first hired as a graduate nurse, we had a suicide patient with a 1-1. The sitter went with the fellow for a walk outside. Our suicide precautions allowed patients and sitters to leave the room. Patient made a run for it. Sitter chased him. They found him on the 5th floor of our parking garage, dangling off the side. He actually had a change of heart, and a staff member went to pull him up. He had an IV in his hand, which got pulled out. The blood from it caused their grip to slip, and the patient fell onto the roof of the 2nd floor and then tumbled down and died afterward. Multiple people witnessed this, as half the patient's room can see the garage from their window. So now our suicide precautions are much more strict. We did have another patient recently who was also on suicidal precautions. The sitter is supposed to maintain direct eyesight with them all the time. Patient was in the bathroom with the door cracked and the sitter couldn't fully see him. He smashed a light bulb and proceeded to cut himself repeatedly and shut the door on the sitter. I think he ended up being okay though. Also had a fellow who was admitted for trying to commit suicide by injecting battery acid into both arms. He was a nice guy. Story 33. So I was on surgery when this happened, but we had a patient who was known to our hospital for sticking light bulbs up his ass when he got stressed. Lots of psych issues, obviously. Go figure, he was back because he'd done it again. So I was familiarizing myself with his case and going through old notes. He's probably had 6 or 7 removals at this point, and every single case report, the surgeon documented the type, chew model of light bulb. I don't know why, but that just amused me beyond belief. Story 34. I once worked on a construction crew building a dormitory for a mental hospital. We saw a few weird things. Some guy walked in with the drywall crew dressed for work. hard hat, work boots, the whole bit. Started banging up drywall, proper lifting, proper measuring. He knew what he was doing, didn't figure it out until coffee time. When the apprentice asked him for money for the coffee run, he just said, "No thanks, I'm gonna run inside and grab one." Guy was a patient. My foreman said, "Hell, if I had to work with a bunch of asshole drywallers like those guys, I'd go nuts too." Another one was seeing a guy who had clearly snuck out the building somehow. He was wearing a bathrobe and slippers and sitting on a park bench. My buddy elbows me and points him out. The guy's sitting there, enjoying the sunshine. Furiously feel good about yourself. It's a nice summer day, might as well crank one out in front of the streetcar tracks, eh? Some poor nurse comes out the door and walks up to him, presumably to bring the guy back inside. As she gets close, she's reaching out to grab his arm when he whirls around and does what can only be described as a Spider-Man and splatters his load on this nurse's face. We're guessing. We were a floor up and about 100 meters away, looking out a window. But from the reaction, it looks like that's what he's done. Those nurses do not get paid enough. Story 35. When a student nurse on my psych clinical rotation, man, who was the king of a large US city, pick up any payphone, and he would answer your call. Not really, but that's what he said. These days, with all the cell phones, finding a payphone is tricky. Hyponatremia, where a person will drink water until it kills them. Bathrooms and water fountains were locked because they'd drink it all. Was a side effect of a psych med. They were weighed several times a day to see if they had ingested a large amount of water. They would even drink their own urine sometimes. A kid who was overly obsessed with death. It was all he talked about. When I asked an older woman how long she'd been there, she said, 9 Christmases, how sad. One patient thought he was a KGB agent, while another thought he was a CIA agent. Guess which two kept following each other around, spying on each other? When I was an actual nurse, a resident who had pica, the overwhelming need to eat non-food items. He tried to eat everything, including my metal pill crusher. I managed to get it away from him, but God was he strong. He left shortly after being admitted as we weren't prepared to deal with someone like that. I felt bad for the people who worked wherever it was that he wound up at. Story 36. When I was a patient, had an old guy screaming and then getting fully undressed before any of the nurses got him. And also while I was there, I was nice to this other patient. She was really sweet and everything. Just not the smartest, I guess. I think she was autistic and just didn't know how to give people space. I was her only friend because everyone else avoided her. Well, one night I see her just standing over me, just watching me. Freaked me the out. So I told her I needed some water and ran out of the room and grabbed a nurse to let me sleep outside because I didn't feel safe in my room anymore. And they dragged a bed out and let me sleep in the hallway where I could be watched, protected better. It was a horrible experience, and I gained like 15 lbs in the 3 days I was there. I hated it and hate it still. Never want to go back there again. The nurses' doctors didn't help me with anything, and I'm still dealing with depression, anxiety, insomnia, and bipolar disorder. Not taking any medications because they don't do so, yep, that's life. Story 37. This didn't happen to me, but to one of my friends. He works as a male nurse, the Hitler grandma. He was taking care of a nice old lady and chatted with her while cleaning and preparing medicine. She was quite skeptical about him because of his big nose. After a while, she asked him if he is Jewish. He jokingly said, "Yeah, this hospital is our resort." The grandma freaked out and screamed, "Hail Hitler! Hail Hitler! I can't believe I'm in a Jewish resort. The Fuhrer will never forgive me." He eventually left the room and told his coworkers. They knew the lady and couldn't believe him because of how nice she always was. So they entered the room and everything was nice. But as soon as my friends went inside the room, the grandma began furiously hailing the Polish fellow. So he had to take care of an old dude with schizophrenia who origins from Poland. His coworkers already warned him. He is easy to handle, but as soon as he starts speaking Polish, you have to watch out. So he entered the room and began doing the usual business like preparing meds and stuff. He was normally chatting with the patient, not thinking about it. The patient switched to talking Polish, but he just ignored it. Suddenly the patient attacked him. That's it, folks. Story 38. My grandfather worked at a mental hospital. His favorite story that he used to tell me went something like this. One day I was watching the wards when all of a sudden a huge fellow came running at me. Well, I was scared out of my pants since there was no way I could possibly fight this guy off. Just as he came close and I thought it was the end for me, he kept running right past to the bathroom that was behind me. He always got a good laugh out of that one. Story 39. Not a mental health worker, but a patient myself at one point. I was there for a suicide attempt. I'm doing much better now. I was a teen at the time and sharing a room with 3 other girls. I woke up in the middle of the night to one of the girls standing by my bed and she was touching my feet and calves. I sat up and asked her what she was doing and she had a complete meltdown and threw herself back on her bed and started crying and muffling her screams into her pillow. I ran and found a nurse and explained what was going on. I followed him back to the room and he came in to talk to her and she started accusing him of raping her. Not previously, but right in that moment. He didn't. Me and the two other girls were there and nothing happened. He was just talking to her and the door was open. Male staff were never alone with any female patients ever. There was an investigation, they interviewed us as witnesses, and he ended up keeping his job, but I could tell he was hurt by the accusation. I'm not sure what was going on with that girl, but I felt bad because she really believed that happened. They ended up moving her to a different facility. Story 40. Late to the party, but I was a psychiatric technician for many years if anyone wants to hear more stories. I'll save my severe ones for anyone interested because they're long and this comment will probably be buried. I had one patient who would rip off her hospital gown and eat it, try to choke herself with the TV wire in the common room, yet was one of the most intelligent patients I've ever had. I noticed she liked to do crosswords, so I printed out as many as I could find and did them with her. Being as how I wasn't afraid of her like the rest of the staff, she really took to me, and I think that my helping her by stimulating her intelligence and actually giving her positive attention contributed to her recovery. One kid had bad schizophrenia from a syphilis infection. Another older woman would constantly scream at the top of her lungs because it was the only thing that drowned out the voices. I also spent a lot of time playing piano on the geriatric ward, which would tend to bring back some of our dementia ALS patients who would hear the songs from their time. The patients aren't bad, they're sick. The workers are horrible, detestable human beings who escalate them on purpose, just to restrain them, because there's an insurance incentive. Story 41. This is the ass credit I've been waiting for. I worked at a psychiatric hospital for 2.5 years when I was 22. My home units were childhood and adolescent and eating disorders. 16-year-old girl ripped my hair out and spit on me, leading to hands-on restraining her for 40 minutes. Once she got into seclusion, she attempted to squirt titty milk at me. It wasn't like dribbling out, it had force behind it like it was a Nerf gun, and then viciously feel good about yourself did. Risperdal makes people lactate. I've been punched in the throat, sexually assaulted, bitten, scratched, hair ripped out, had dirty bathwater dumped over my head, been looked dead in the face, while a teenage girl slit her wrists with glass from a lamp she punched, had to untie or cut clothes and sheets from patients' necks, seen teenagers eat screws, batteries, and pens, seen a girl shove spaghetti up her vagina, had a patient headbang so hard she detached her eyeball, had to observe teenage boys while they feel good about yourself and looked me in the face and smiled. Seen a girl with a softball-sized prolapsed rectum squirt shit all over the bathroom. Been the first person a teenage girl told about being a victim of an ongoing extensive rape game her abuser played with her. Truly something out of SVU. Story 42. I'm studying psychology, counseling, and therapies at university, and we would occasionally have a guest lecturer come in who was awesome. He worked in the field of mental health, so this is his story, and I'll try to remember it as best as I can. The lecturer told us that the next slide was a story that happened to a patient that he was working with, and that we were to read it ourselves. I guess he wanted to gauge our reactions. He swapped to the next page, and as people read what was on the slide, the color drained from all our faces, and everyone had the same horrified look. You could practically hear the jaws hitting the floor. The slide mentioned a man who was found by a nurse and the lecturer, covered in his own blood, but otherwise seemingly calm. The patient had somehow gotten a hold of a craft knife and used it to cut open his own scrotum. He then felt around inside the wound and pulled out what was in there. When he was found, he was still playing with what he'd pulled out of his own scrotum. When asked why he'd done it, he stated he was simply curious to know what was inside. Story 43. Way too late in the game for this to matter. I've seen lots of poop, puke, and piss used as a weapon. People covering their rooms in it and rolling around in it. People drinking their own pee-ect. Lots of shallowing random things. People eating things you would never imagine. Lots of inserting. I'm sure you can imagine, and I don't need to elaborate. I've seen weird family dynamics and friendships. I've seen the people who are ostracized from society in a locked facility and how that impacts them. I've seen a great deal of fights and violence, people biting parts of others' faces off, lip once, nose once. But these people are sick. They are there for help, and it's okay for them to act that way there. They are getting the help they need. I've also seen a lot of amazing things there. These people are often having the worst days of their lives. I've seen amazing resilience. I've learned so much about accepting both myself and others. I've learned about patience and suffering. It's been an experience I can't really sum up into words. Story 44. Kind of hate nurses a little bit after my experience working in hospitals. I worked nutrition and floated between a lot of floors. The nurses never marked rooms, hazardous, infectious, etc. It pissed me off because I was exposed to some nasty stuff. Anyway, there was a patient that was supposed to be marked hazardous, but wasn't. I walked in to talk about her diet during her stay, and she seemed like a normal patient, just quiet. I stepped right outside the door to finish her paperwork, before I noticed I forgot to ask her something. I walked back in and she was gone. It's a hospital room, so one quick look around and you could tell no one was in the room. I went check under the bed when a hand came from between the mattress and Journey and grabbed my leg hard. It scared the shit out of me. Her muffled screams and laughs were terrifying, and her grip left some serious bruises. She was eventually transferred to a psych ward across the street where my dad worked. She did the same thing to him, only he got bit too. I'm glad she didn't have any transferable diseases. Story 45. I work in a trauma center and we have a section for extreme cases of mental illness, or generally someone who might be having a severe reaction to drugs, alcohol. I had an 80-pound girl on meth lift a hospital bed upright, 200-pound bed climb on the top and proceed to get into the ceiling tiles, which she believed was a bomb shelter that would protect her from the mutants. So when the security guard put his hand up there to grip so he could lift himself up, she apparently licked his hand, which startled him so badly he fell 6 to 8 feet to the floor, and then she proceeded to scream, "It tastes salty! You are all infected!" Yes, she paused awkwardly between words, at the top of her lungs, over and over. Yeah, fun night. We eventually got her down by bribing her with some peanut butter and crackers, though. Also, we officially removed the ceiling tiles in the mental health rooms. Now they are solid across, which makes the rooms even more depressing. Story 46. Obligatory, not me, but my mom, who worked in psych nursing from after college, switching to nights when I was young at the hospital near our house. Both big-ish cities. So, lots of patients of all kinds, haha. My mom had chairs thrown at her that broke windows. She told me about a girl who had bad OCD and some other stuff, and she would pull out her eyelashes and eventually her eyebrows. My mom said it was a lot stranger, unsettling looking than you would expect. She doesn't seem to like talking about those years much. She also mentions every so often how, around the full moon, people definitely get stranger. Mental illnesses acting up more than usual, just strange behavior. Totally matter of fact about it for a lady who grew up Catholic and isn't superstitious at all. That was always fascinating to me. Unrelated, I've spent time in psych hospitals myself. Never seen anything to that extreme, but they definitely keep the more hazardous patients separated from the suicidal addicts, etc. Interesting places since I like people watching. You definitely see some shit. Story 47. I had a male come into the behavior section of an ER, completely hysterical and trying to get his family to leave him alone by holding a knife to his own throat and threatening to kill himself while I spoke with him. He cried about the intense pain and how he could not deal with the cat scratch he had given himself. Literally looked like a paperclip scratch, didn't even break skin, and would never do anything like that again because it hurt so bad. Doc decides to let him go, only to find out he can't leave the hospital because he needs to report to the OB ward where his girlfriend is currently giving birth. Story 48. Not a mental hospital worker, but I work with the homeless a lot, as one of my best friends is a pastor at a community church. I once went out into the woods about 1.5 miles walking to help a homeless man move 1 or 2 boxes of stuff. He was living in the woods with 40-50 boxes of feces, trash, rotting food mix, and wanted me to carry all of that out and move it in my car into storage. I tried to explain to him both that I don't want to move boxes of feces and that it wouldn't even fit into my car, even if I wanted to. So we settled on 4 boxes of clean stuff and had to call the forest ranger to pick up the rest. I gave Than Ranger $50 because I felt really bad that he would have to do that for free otherwise. Story 49. I did a rotation on a long-term ward for the sickest of the sick schizophrenics. Some of these people had been there for several decades and were never getting out. In one ward, we had not 1, not 2, but 3 people who believed they were God Jesus. One who alternated between thinking she was the Virgin Mary and thinking she had killed Jesus. 2 fire starters. One who thought they were related to regularly, conversing internally with various US presidents, and would only take a shower if Obama called and told them to, resulting in an extremely foul-smelling ward. One who thought he was a serial killer but was actually harmless. One with severe pica syndrome, in which you eat non-edible things like metal, or in this patient's case, shoes. And all of this is not counting the rest, who were just your average paranoid schizophrenic with occasionally violent tendencies. It was a fun rotation. Can't make this shit up. Story 50. You know, the sad thing is I know I've got stories, literally dozens that I could tell people that would be worth a laugh or something to gasp at. I bet I've even encountered something today that was worth retelling. But you know what? It's all become so mundane and difficult to remember. All these situations seem to jumble together in my mind, and I can't even tell when I run into something noteworthy anymore. I've heard of people swallowing tons of things. I've encountered all kinds of bodily fluids. I've seen celebrities be admitted. No A-listers, obviously, and no, I'm not going to say who. Don't bother asking. I've had bizarre conversations that would make your head spin. I've seen people hallucinate wildly and act upon them. I've seen terrible acts of random violence. Yet, when I come home at the end of the day and my wife asks me, "How was work?" I never respond with, "You won't believe what happened," anymore. All I really have in me is, "Fine." Story 51. An old family friend told us a story about an incident that took place with her when she was working as a psychiatrist in a nut house. She was a rather small and skinny woman, 116 centimeter or so. Anyhow, a patient came to her office, a big strong man, and closed the door, opened his suitcase and said, "Now we are going to operate you." Now remember, this was about 3 to 4 decades ago, and there were no security measures in loony offices. Nonetheless, this took place in Soviet times. So, the guy opens his suitcase, which is full of knives and scalpels and such. He's blocking the way and there's no option of her escaping. She asks the patient, "But with which colored thread are we going to sew me together?" Patient, "Oh yeah, hadn't thought about that. I'll find some." He ran out the door. And so did she, escaping. It's weird how a person's brain works in such situations. Story 52. I just stopped working in a psych ward a few months ago. I would see and hear so many bizarre things daily that it became normal. However, I'll never forget the first time I saw a patient go into 5 points, which is essentially when they get strapped down to their bed and can't move at all. This precaution is only taken when the person is at extreme risk of hurting themselves or others. I'll never forget the screams coming from her room and the crying. It sounded like pure terror, and it made me so upset. She just sounded like she was in complete agony, made me feel completely awful. In the staff's defense, they tried multiple different things to calm this patient down, but she wouldn't stop banging her head against the wall as hard as she could. It was so sad. I hope she's doing better now. Story 53. A nurse I work with was doing clinicals in nursing school. There was a schizophrenic patient who was obsessed with her. He knew what days and times she came, and he also knew how long she was there for. 6 weeks. He knew on the last day she wasn't coming back. The next day, another student got a call from their professor asking if the patient was showing signs of aggression at all when she worked with him. Turns out the patient grabbed a pen from the nurse's station, went into another room and stabbed their eyes out. The students weren't allowed on the floor after that. Story 54. I used to work in a hospice, a hospital, and an assisted living facility. The one that stood out to me the most was when I did my clinicals in a psych ward at the hospital. There was an older gentleman who would walk around the living area and stop every few seconds. After a few days of that, I finally asked him what he was doing. He got into a superhero pose and with a straight face said, "I am Wolverine," then continued on his way. He did his hair every day like the character and even learned to speak like him. Not so much crazy as it was interesting. Every time I passed him, I would ask him how the X-Men trainees were doing, and he would always reply with a scowl. Story 55. Worked security at a hospital that required tours through all floors, including the psych wing, not including the numerous responses to emergency codes. Walking by an elderly 65-ish woman's bedroom, she's kneeling on the bed, stark naked. Feel good about yourself-ing, not like you think. This woman is spitting on her fingers and slapping her vagina. Spit, thwop, spit, thwop, spit, thwop, spit, thwop. Okay, everything looks good up here. Call if you need anything, keyby, edit, formatting. Story 56. Lots of razors, blades, and vaginas. Old ladies taping Ativan pills to the bottom of their feet. Teenagers starting riots. But I'd have to give the trophy to a 365 lb woman who stripped naked, charged at my colleague and then tried to shit on us while she was restrained. Ever seen a woman shit in the prone position? It's like watching a brown Eiffel Tower emerge from their ass, going straight up and then collapse on itself. After getting her into a seclusion room because she was continuing to try and bite and kick others, the doc changed their mind and decided that they did want to give meds after all, meaning we had to gown up and go back in to wrestle this now piss and feces soaked woman all over again. Story 57. A friend of mine told me when he was in alcohol detox, he would hear rats running around inside the suspended ceiling of where he was staying. He said he saw dust and pieces of tile falling to the floor from the cracks near the light fixture. He kept telling the nurses, but they ignored him and wouldn't even look down to see if there really was something on the floor. Finally, someone looked down, and indeed, there was debris on the floor. They called the guy immediately on the account that it was a healthcare delivery place. It turns out there was no rats. It was just my friend's brain playing tricks on him. Okay, it was me. My brain was playing tricks on me. Don't judge me, you don't know me. Story 58. My grandfather worked at a mental hospital in the late 70s. One Christmas, when my dad was very young, he made a small toy soldier out of cardboard. He painted it with red paint like a uniform and stuck an iron nail through one side, so it looked like a soldier standing straight, the nail being the soldier's rifle. My grandfather brought it into his work because he thought it was sweet. A day or two later, He found it ripped up with the nail missing. 2 days later, they found a patient who tried to kill themselves with it. Don't bring nails into mental hospitals. Story 59. Not an employee, but a patient. The craziest thing I saw was this other patient named Elle. She knew the entire Bible by heart. She tripped a nurse, then broke the nurse's wrist. She'd go off on biblical speeches about random subjects. We should all drink our chocolate milk to be saved by God's light, apparently. And she would come into my room at night, hold my hand, and pat my hair. I was obviously awake, just didn't dare to move. Eventually, I figured out she was terrified by my Batman pop figurine, so I used that to ward her off. Story 60. When I was inpatient, my roommate with multiple personality would sit next to my bed of the ground and stare at me sleeping, her face inches from mine. She did this when she was in her cat personality. I'd tell her we had to practice our ABC as sign language, and that we couldn't do it until she got back in her bed. I voiced my concerns and feeling unsafe, sleeping in a room with her to the staff, and asked to change rooms to one that the person didn't have a roommate, and they didn't give a shit or do anything. Most of us were abused and depressed or have substance problems. Mine was depression, eating disorder, and anxiety. Story 61. In med school, you have to do a rotation in psychology. So, my husband did his at a mental hospital. He came home with a lot of interesting stories. His first day there, literally 10 minutes in, a lady shuffled up to him and told him she'd give him a blowjob if he got her out of there. A favorite of mine is the time a woman came to the room where they hand out the meds and asked for an extra dose of Tylenol. Just asked like any person would. The guy said he'd have to call the doctor first to see if that was okay. She screamed, "That's bullshit," and pulled down her pants and shit on the floor right there. Story 62. Not particularly crazy, but I found this funny. I was assessing a guy with bipolar disorder in a manic phase. He was clearly psychotic with delusions and significant thought disorder. When I saw him, he was topless with a blue sheet over his head. This was to stop the light from burning him. He looked a little like one of the ghosts in Pac-Man. When I offered him a glass of water, he accepted and drank the water while the sheet was still over his head, spilling the water down the sheet and onto the floor. Saw him months later and he was in a much better mental state. Very nice chap. Story 63. I'm probably too late, but I was put in one as a teenager. There we had shared rooms and my roommate claimed to see demons. You don't know how scary it is to wake up to your roommate saying all the demons in the room wanted to kill me while just sitting up and staring at you around 3 in the morning. There was also a girl that had depression and had been in and out of the place for years, that found a way to slit her wrists and started to run around the ward, spraying blood like she was Spider-Man shooting webs. Dear God, I still remember all of the blood on the walls like it was yesterday. Story 64. I've told this story before, but the TLDR is this. Went to move a guy out of an apartment into a facility. Was his case manager, which meant I'm kind of the do-all guy. He had one of those old-fashioned refrigerators that was just one giant compartment. It was 8 feet tall, 4 feet wide, 3 feet deep, and it had 8 shelves. Each shelf was packed wall-to-wall, front to back, with gallon milk jugs of piss. Each shelf was 8 to 6-gallon jugs of piss. Almost 400-gallon jugs of piss. I had his brother take them down the hall to the communal bathroom to dump them. Story 65. We had a psyche the other day. She kept laughing and smiling hysterically, deliriously, 1,000-yard stare right through you and blabbering how they were waiting for her outside in the clouds. Then suddenly she'd start screaming in panic. No, that is not nice. Why would you only put the bodies in the suitcases? You have to send the heads too. They should be whole. And then she'd be smiling again. And I asked, what are you seeing? Who's there? And she'd point and say, my brother, my son, my mother, my father, my grandmother, etc. They're all waving. And she'd wave back. Nice lady. Bless her heart. Story 66. During my stint in nursing school clinicals to the mental health hospital, we had one pretty young guy who exhibited extreme religiosity delusions with his schizophrenia. He thought his work was for Jesus, and he liked to bless people by talking in tongues. And the other schizophrenic, who was probably in his 40s, and he swore up and down that he had been married to Taylor Swift before she was popular, then would hiss at people he didn't like a cat. Story 67. I have to admit I hated working there. I felt like I was going crazy. Nothing against mental illness. I have depression and anxiety. But managing people with schizophrenia, for example, was so hard. Anyway, one that stands out to me is my patient, who chopped off her own hand and flushed it down the toilet. They dug her hand out of the toilet and reattached it quite successfully, though she refused to engage in hand therapy. The image of that just doesn't go away. Story 68. Well, I wasn't working at one, but I put myself in one when I was 16 because I was freaking out from how depressed and was concerned with how often I thought of suicide. Anyways, apparently, the girl that had the room before me tried to escape through the ceiling. I guess she hit a nurse because the other patients mentioned she had her arms tied to her side for like a week. So when they finally untied her arms, she had issues moving them too far from her sides. Also, for unknown reasons, girls weren't allowed to have tampons. Pads only. Weird. Story 69. I had one kid tear the padding off the floor of the seclusion room and eat it, then puke all over the room and eat that. This same kid sexually assaulted multiple staff members, including me, and punched himself in the face so hard, he broke his eye socket. Just recently, I tackled a kid on the highway. She had campus privileges because of long-term safe behavior, but impulsively tried to jump in front of the truck. I got her and had to hold her myself until other staff got there for about 3 minutes. Longest 3 minutes of my life. Story 70. I don't usually post on here, but about 5 years ago, I did have a stay at an institute for a 5150 incident, and the weirdest part was the first night when I was finally bunked into a room with someone, and she kept calling me Julie, and that was 100% not my name. Other than that, there were very kind people that just were going through mental disorders. One even drew me a picture and said, "You're stronger than us here. Good luck." I will never forget that. Story 71. I went to a school for kids with mental health issues, if that counts, but we were playing lawn bowling. A kid bowls it over the goddamn fence, and then climbs it to get it into the Jewish Center's backyard next door. It was a converted house next to us, completely derailing an event that was going on and scaring the shit out of a bunch of old people. He did not fetch the ball. He just kept running.